Multiplayer games are, at their core, social. They offer the chance to interact with strangers across the world, and with that, deliver a kind of endless variety. Every match, every encounter is a roll of the dice. But that same variety will also deliver you the worst humanity has to offer. Cheaters, griefers, or just the plain unpleasant. They're a constant presence, and rarely a quiet one. Behaviour like this doesn't exist in a vacuum. It changes how people play, how they interact, and in some cases, whether they bother playing at all. But why does it matter so much? In today's video, we'll be looking at antisocial behaviour in games, the ways in which it manifests, the impact that it has, and the ways that games can work toward preventing it. Antisocial behaviour, sometimes abbreviated to ASB, refers to actions that cause harm and distress to others, or undermine the norms and expectations of a social setting. It can be both legal and illegal in nature, and varies from minor to major, depending on what form the behaviour takes on. In the real world, while antisocial behaviour and criminal behaviour overlap significantly, they aren't the same. Insider trading is a crime, but there are no direct social victims. Playing loud music in public isn't necessarily a crime, but it is considered antisocial. Societal expectations are pretty consistent anywhere you go in the world, and tend to have short and long-term consequences for anyone involved. In the virtual world, however, the rules are vastly different. The issue, and where a lot of the blurring of the lines comes from, is that in the real world, you are yourself. And anything that happens to you, well, happens directly to you. But in online gaming, or just online in general, you are often controlling a proxy for yourself, where things can happen without physical consequence to the real you. Which means that actions that affect you are first filtered through this layer. Getting ganked in a game might be something you can just laugh off, but in real life it might cause you a bit more inconvenience. As a result of this abstraction, what does and doesn't affect people becomes a more subjective matter. It's also a largely anonymous experience, which shields people from the usual consequences that they might expect in the real world. Verbal abuse, for example, is a lot easier when someone is hundreds of miles away instead of directly in front of you, and any punishment a games company can dish out will never compare to what a government could. These two factors mean that antisocial behaviour is both really difficult to pin down and really difficult to address online. Because how do we properly define unacceptable behaviour, and how do we even enforce it effectively? I had an issue early on when I used to stream on Twitch, where a couple of regular viewers would compete in my Rocket League tournaments, and every time they lost, they would have a full-scale argument with each other in my chat. The problem I had was they weren't technically breaking any rules by just having an argument, but it was still turning my chat into a really toxic place to be, and it was starting to affect others who would show up in the stream. At the time, I didn't really have a good answer for it. Do I ban them from arguing? How much arguing is too much? After I did ban them, they started making alternate accounts just to harass the stream. How do you deal with something like that? This is where the problem lies. There's nothing concrete. So we understand the problem at hand, but why do we even care if people are being antisocial? Most of the time it's temporary, from people you'll see once and then never again. Surely if that's how people choose to live their life with the games they paid for, that's their choice, right? Well, it would be more manageable if the effects did not extend beyond the person, but they often do. And these effects impact the games we enjoy, and prevents them from reaching their full potential. One way they manifest is what we would describe as a culture of non-participation, or minimal engagement. Have you ever played a game that used strong social features like proximity voice, only to notice that over time it would be used less and less? This is actually a problem partly downstream from antisocial behaviour. People will engage with systems when they receive positive reinforcement from them. This is why emote systems in games like Helldivers 2 or the Souls series are so effective. They're simple, there's little to no punishment that comes from using them, and the interactions are almost always positive. This positive reinforcement is also evident in recently released games, where everybody is experiencing something new, and the more competitive aspects of the game haven't taken hold yet. a carefree, zero consequences atmosphere is a great place to foster communication and helps people on the fence about communicating cross that line. Once people start taking their frustrations out on other players, it creates negative feedback, not just for the recipient, but also the people who witness it, which can then discourage people from engaging socially. Eventually you end up with those silent lobbies, where actually using social features is the exception rather than the rule. And it's way harder to be the first person to speak than the ninth. It's an incredibly hard thing to prevent from happening, which is why smaller scale alternatives for friend groups, sometimes referred to as friend slop, are pretty common and popular ways to experience these features within the more comfortable confines of a friend group. Negative feedback doesn't just stop social features, it also discourages experimentation, potentially leading people to make choices in a team game just to avoid inconveniencing others, and risk becoming the target of blame or frustration, which makes specifically games that center around cooperation much flatter and less dynamic than they otherwise would be. Targeting players for being off meta is a very easy crutch to use for justifying abuse, and it trains players to prioritize avoiding blame over enjoying the game in their own way. While it's not unreasonable to expect players in a competitive setting to play as effectively as they can, the problem comes when that mindset is carried over to non-competitive environments, such as PvE games. Helldivers 2 in its early days had a huge issue with its balancing, and it led to an environment where not using certain weapons was seen as throwing, which is odd considering its cooperative nature, but it caused people to face ramifications for playing a non-competitive game the way they wanted. Beyond the cultural impact, you also have the more direct, egregious examples of antisocial gaming, such as griefing, hacking, or exploits. These often have serious and long-term effects on player retention, and if not properly managed, can scare off players in serious numbers. Cheating in particular can undermine the systems and rules that a game operates by, which often means that developers have to spend a lot of valuable time combating it, rather than doing something more productive. This behaviour often leads to heavy-handed moderation, such as DRM and intrusive anti-cheat systems. Oftentimes innocent players get caught in the crossfire. You also have the problem, of course, of your gameplay being directly impacted by cheaters. A lot of modern games have much higher levels of commitment compared to the pick up and put down nature of older titles, which means that a cheater could ruin hours of effort instead of just minutes, and if you're working full time, those hours could be in short supply. The problem at its simplest is pretty obvious if you spend any amount of time in a social setting. People bad. Some people will invariably have bad intentions, and the fact that the online realm is anonymous and lacks any real consequences certainly doesn't help. So how do you even begin to address something like this at scale? Well, the most direct answer is to make the online world more like the real world by removing anonymity and adding real-world consequences, which, personally, are both bad ideas that run counter to the main benefits of the virtual world, which are that it is anonymous and largely consequence-free. There are advocates for both of these positions, with very valid arguments such as child safety and national security. Obviously, this is entering the territory of politics, and I am but a humble gaming YouTuber. But I think in the context of moderating gaming spaces, there are many more alternatives that can be used effectively. Solutions that are often used to counter antisocial behaviour are anti-cheat and reporting systems, which hope to use both software and the players themselves to offload the burden of moderation. We can see the effects of these in almost every multiplayer game we play, as almost all of them use some level of anti-cheat and feature some level of reporting feature. While these systems do work, they suffer on the scale of entire communities, as it's moderately easy to sidestep these systems if you're familiar with them. You also have the more advanced moderation techniques, such as IP bans and kernel-level anti-cheat. These, while very heavy-handed, tend to have unintended consequences, kernel level anti-cheat, for example, accesses your system at the deepest level, which, while it might be effective at detecting foul play, raises privacy concerns, as it has full access to everything on your PC. It kind of seems like an unwinnable battle in many ways, and it largely is. It's a bit like expecting a government to make the crime rate 0. It's just not feasible. So really the objective is to minimize it as much as possible. An important method that is often overlooked is player incentives. There's this story about World of Warcraft that is mentioned in this great video by Game Maker's Toolkit, and to summarize it even more than he did, Blizzard had a system to discourage players from playing too long, by reducing the experience they would get the longer they played. But players hated the feeling of diminishing returns, so instead they flipped the system completely by giving them an experience boost the longer they spent offline. They hadn't really changed how the numbers worked, but by framing it as an incentive rather than a disincentive, they naturally push people to the desired outcome. When it comes to antisocial behaviour, the answer may not be to just discourage it, but instead to encourage pro-social behaviour. You could reward players for maintaining a clean track record, or for frequently using the game's social systems. I think a major complaint I have about a lot of modern games is that they're afraid of tying any decent advantages to social systems like this. It's obviously not as simple as rewarding good behaviour, because it's very easy to create perverse incentives. And it's very hard to out-incentivize cheating, for example. Another way games can discourage antisocial behaviour is by setting up social consequences and finding more ways for players to invest into the games they play. A lot of MMOs, for example, have players take part in social structures, such as clans or guilds, which adds a layer of player persistence modern games often lack. When somebody is toxic in a matchmaking game, the people they interact with aren't persistent to them. It's very unlikely that you'll match with people more than once in a reasonable time frame, so burning any bridges is effectively meaningless, as the bridges will cease to exist anyway once the match ends. Adding clan features specifically adds a layer of investment, which makes players less likely to engage in risky behaviour, out of fear of losing what they've built up with others. Also, features like community servers or persistent lobbies, which have become rarer in recent years, can add a layer of investment that is otherwise missed. Much like in the real world, getting rid of antisocial behaviour in games is a nigh impossible task, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. There are many problems to be addressed, but there are just as many solutions. It's just a case of finding the right one. Maybe the uncertain future of AI might have some answers for us. Maybe someone in the comments will be one to solve it. Only time will tell. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more videos in the future.